Welcome back to the channel, and in this video I'm going to talk to you a little bit about mechanical keyboards. Let's talk about what's a mechanical keyboard first. A mechanical keyboard is different from a conventional keyboard in the sense that the actuation mechanism of the switch is different. So in this keyboard, this is a traditional, like a membrane keyboard. So you have like a membrane which is made of silicone, which when you press the key down, that makes a contact and sends a signal that you pressed the key. In the case of a mechanical keyboard, under each key you have a switch like this that when you press, it sends a signal for each key, and the benefit of that is that it gives you more tactile feedback. The overall feel of typing on the keys is way better, and the longevity of the keyboard is also much longer compared to a membrane keyboard. Now let's talk about what goes into the layout of keyboards. So now this is a conventional keyboard which you would see, which has a full-size layout, which has the numeric pad, navigation keys, the arrow keys, and all of the function keys on top, in addition to the regular alphabets and all the other keys. Now you will hear this term. Now this is called a 100% keyboard or a full-size keyboard. You'll hear the term TKL, or the 10 keyless keyboard, which basically eliminates the numpad. So you're going to have the function row on top, you have the nav keys and the arrow keys, but you're just going to miss this. So that lowers the footprint and makes it smaller. Now, if you look at this keyboard, this is an 85% keyboard. If I place this side by side, you'll see it's much smaller. Now it does have the function rows and the nav keys and the arrow keys, but it has them all crunched together. Now this is what you would call a condensed 10 keyless design, or a 75% layout. If you take that further, you have a more compact form factor, and this is what I presently use. This is called a 60% layout. What this does is it gets rid of the arrow keys, the function row on top, and the nav keys, and it gives you all the standard size keys with a function button. So you can now use your function button and access all the functionality that you would have with regular keys using the function button, and there's layers. This may appear limiting to some people initially, but then once you get used to the function layout, you find that this makes you more efficient because you're not moving your arm around the keyboard, and it's a much smaller layout. But anyway, this goes down to personal preference, but these are the typical layouts. You do have smaller layouts than 60%, but I feel that complicates things way more. So 60% is what I would recommend for regular users who are not keyboard geeks. Okay, the next thing is switches. Now, I showed you this before. This is what a typical mechanical keyboard switch looks like. Now, there are two types of switches. You have conventional mechanical switches where there's an electric contact that happens between copper leaves inside of the switch mechanism. So when you push down on this stem, it makes a contact between two pieces of copper, and that has electric pins that stick out at the bottom and then sends that signal to the board and to the computer. And that tells you what key you pressed. That is a conventional mechanical switch. There's a new kind of mechanical switch called the optical mechanical switch. And in this case, what happens is there's an infrared signal that is being sent between 2 points on the board. And when you press down on this switch, you notice right at the bottom here that, I don't know if you can see that. So when you press down, the stem is actually coming down there and blocking an opening. So that interrupts the signal between the infrared. There's two diodes on the PCB for each switch. And when that infrared light gets interrupted, that is recorded as a signal. Some people who are keyboard purists don't like optical switches because they think it's not true mechanical switches. But Optical switches are considered faster and more reliable by some people. To me, the real difference comes down to the types of switches or the availability of the types of switches when you choose optical versus traditional mechanical switches. Now, regardless, you are going to have an optical stem at the bottom, or you will have electric contacts, but you would be putting these switches onto the board, or if you buy a pre-built keyboard, you have a board that comes with the switches. Now, these switches could be, if you have regular electric contacts, they could be soldered onto the board, or they could be hot swappable, meaning that you can, they're not soldered using lead or tin solder, so you can actually pull them off the PCB and put a different switch in and it'll work. So that gives you a little more customizability if you don't want to get your feet wet with soldering. You also have different feel of switches. So there's blue switches, which are typically clicky, and people who are into a lot of typing prefer that strong feedback or from the switch. They prefer these clicky switches. And then there's brown switches, which are tactile, and then there's red switches, which are linear. Now, tactiles are not as noisy as the blue clicky switches, so they're sort of, think of them as in between, where you do have, there's a tactile bump when the switch activates, but you do not find it to be too loud and distracting. At the same time, there is a little bit of feedback. Now, linear switches are preferred by people who are into gaming. Typically, it allows you to make multiple key presses without having to fully release. So this is preferred when you're gaming, and then the activation is also somewhat faster when it comes to linear switches. So this black one here is also linear. The difference between the black and the red is that the black has more spring tension compared to the red. So again, do your research. This is not a video about switch types, but basically those are the three. You have linear, you have tactile, and clicky switches. Now let's talk about keycaps. Keycaps are the things that sit on top of the switch themselves. So if I pull one out, you'll see how this looks. So here's a keycap, and this keyboard has a brown switch. So we have a keycap that goes and fits onto that. So it has a little, like a plus sign or a cross pattern on it, and that's what it uses to clip onto the switch itself. And you just push it on there, and that's how it sits. Now, the keycaps can come in different types. You have most keycaps made of two types of plastic. There's ABS and there's PBT. Now, PBT is the recommended or the preferred kind of plastic. ABS is if you remember old keyboards that have been used for a while and you see people typing on them, after a while you see that parts of the keys start developing kind of a shine and it doesn't look nice. That is the ABS plastic typically that does that. PBT is a more durable kind of plastic which doesn't develop that glossy shine when you use it over a period of time. Now, all the keyboards that I have PBT keycaps here. Ignore this one, this is not a mechanical. Once you choose keycaps which are PBT, now there's two types within that. You can have what is called dye-sub or dye-sublimated keycaps. Now in this case, if I turn on the lights, you see that the lights glow under the keys but not through the keys, and that is because legends are not, they're sort of printed. I wouldn't say they're printed, but they're dye-sublimated. It's a different process, so it doesn't wear off if you use the key for a long period of time, but it does not allow the light to shine through. Now, this is more popular among people who are into text typing who don't necessarily need to see the legends on the keys. But then this is another type, which is shine-through keycaps. So if I turn this on, hopefully you can see that, and these are RGB lights that shine through the keys, and you can kind of toggle between them and gives you different effects. The way that they do this is these keys are called double shot keys. So the legend itself is made of a different kind of plastic, and so you have like a white plastic on the inside and a gray plastic on the outside. So when the light shines through this, it's actually shining through the plastic. So even here, you have the benefit that even if you use this for many years, you're not gonna wear out the legends. And if you want your light to shine through, you want to get keycaps that are shine through like this, double shot PBT, or these are diced out PBTs if you don't care about the light shining through. You might also notice that the profile of the keys is slightly different. So if you look at this keyboard, all the keys are of the same height. So the different rows of keys all have the same height, which is not the same when you look at this one. And you see that the tops of the keys are somewhat angled. So that's what you call the profile of the keycap. And when you buy a set of keycaps, you buy a keyboard which comes with a pre-installed set of keycaps. You want to see what kind of profile it is. And again, this comes down to personal preference. This is flat, like how you would find the keys on a laptop. This one has the upper rows somewhat raised, and the contours of the keys are also a little bit more pronounced. So it kind of, your fingers sit better on that, and it's easier to reach some of the top keys. So again, this comes down to personal preference. Over a period of time, me swapping between, this is called an OEM or a DSA profile. This is an OEM profile. And there's other profiles like SA profiles which go even higher. So again, it comes down to personal preference. I haven't found too much of a difference swapping between these two since they're on the same layout. All right, we said that there's switches, there's keycaps. Let's see what more there is to a keyboard. You will notice that most of these keys are of a certain size, and this is called 1 unit. So if I look at any of these alphabets, like the B or the N, it's 1 unit. But if I look at this Alt button here, that is a slightly bigger unit. It's a 1.25. If I look at the Shift or the caps or the tab, all of these are different sizes. So they're either like a 1.75 or a 2 unit or a 2.25. And the spacebar, for example, is a 6.75, I believe, units. So how do these keys work? They still have single switch, but if these keys are bigger, how do they work? So any key that is bigger than 2 units wide has what is called a stabilizer next to it. So let me pull out the spacebar and show you what I mean. So here you have the switch in the middle, and on the sides you have what are called stabilizers. And these stabilizers are not switches, but they're just there to help you balance the key. And as you press the keycap, make sure that regardless of what part of the keycap you're pressing, that the switch gets activated the same way. Stabilizers are a very important part of a keyboard or a keyboard build, because if you use a stabilizer which is just off the shelf, now that stabilizer has these 2 black pieces that you see and a rod connecting them or a wire connecting them, which helps balance the motion of the whole key. Typically they don't come lubed, and you want to apply some sort of dielectric grease to lubricate the stabilizers to improve the feel. So most of the times when you press down on a spacebar, it's very clacky, sometimes tinny and rattly. You want to make that sound better. You notice this one, even though it's a mechanical keyboard, it sounds way better than this membrane keyboard, which is just so clacky and just doesn't sound nice. You do that, you achieve that by modding your stabilizers. So most people, and this is something that you can look up in more detail, I'm not going to go too much into it. There's like little legs that attach to the stems of these stabilizers. So you clip those legs, you apply dielectric grease, and then you pop this back on, and it works much better. So you notice that, and it's so much better than that rattly spacebar over there. And for example, this one, is a mechanical keyboard with an unmodded stabilizer on the spacebar. This is a modded stabilizer. You notice how much of a difference that is in terms of acoustics and feel. Okay, so after that, now you have all of these items, the switches and the keycaps and the stabilizers, but they all need to sit together somewhere. So you have what is called the plate and the PCB. So let me take a couple of keys off here and you'll see what I mean. I'm gonna turn these lights off so you can see it better. So here you've got a white surface on which these keys are sitting. Now that white surface is called a plate. Basically what it is it's a few millimeters thick. It's got these holes cut out for all the switches that need to fit through it, and it can be mounted on top of the PCB or the board itself. So your plate for the keyboard will need to support the layout that you have for your keyboard. So if you're building your own keyboard, you want to make sure that you buy the plate that matches the circuit or the PCB that you have for your keyboard, and it matches the overall size layout for the case that you have. Now, as you mount the switches, you also want to see that this adds to some level of rigidity for the keyboard, so there is no flex. Like this one is absolutely solid. So the plate is made of aluminum. You can get plates that are made of brass, plates that are made of acrylic, different materials. Again, the color of the plate, it helps with the amount of underglow that you see. So a black plate like the one on this keyboard is going to reflect less light compared to a white plate on this keyboard. So if you want to see those RGB lights pop, you want something which is a white plate. Now below the plate you have the PCB itself, and this is what people generally call the board. Now the board is the brains of your keyboard. This is where there are certain controllers, there's a certain bit of memory, and I'm not too familiar with all the technology behind it, but that is what allows you to convert these dumb switches to something that can talk to your computer and provide commands to your computer. So as you are going into purchasing a keyboard, you want to think about what kind of a board you want on it, because the board will determine how much customizability you have with the keyboard, how much what the layout is going to be like. For example, this one, I can hold the function keys and use these buttons as arrows. Now that is because that's the way this board is programmed. Now if I wanted a board which allowed me to use the WASD as the arrows, I would need to either be able to reprogram this board or buy a board which supported that functionality. Now again, this comes down to personal preference, but the board is what determines that. The board also determines what's your connectivity. Now most of the newer boards come with USB-C, but you still find boards that have micro USB or God forbid mini USB. So make sure that the board that you're buying supports that. The board also determines if you need to solder your switches or the switches can be hot swappable. Board also determines whether you're going to have conventional mechanical switches or optical switches. Lastly, we have the case itself. Now this case it's made of white ABS. It's pretty thick ABS, and this one is made of black ABS plastic. So you can get cases made of any material. People buy metallic cases which are milled out of CNC aluminum, anodized aluminum. People have cases made out of wood, acrylic, and sometimes the choice of the case adds to the feel of the keyboard, because having a case which is heavy makes your keyboard build overall feel more solid. Also, when you have a lot of empty space under the keys, it can cause some acoustic resonance and some pinging noises. So people fill up the space under the board with some filling material. So for example, this keyboard if I knock it at the back, you see it doesn't have a hollow sound. And the reason is I cut up foam from an old yoga mat and used it to fill up the base of this keyboard, like the case under the PCB, and that absorbs and dampens any sort of harsh noises. So these are all modifications you can do. You can also paint the case itself if you want to change the color of the case that you already have. So that's one of the other things that you can customize. So yeah, I think that kind of wraps up everything that I had to say today. In conclusion, mechanical keyboards, they can be a pretty addictive hobby. There is a lot of jargon out there, so I hope that if you're new to this, some of the things that I spoke about here are helpful and help you kind of understand and demystify some of that jargon. And there's a whole world of customization out there waiting for you. So yeah, good luck with your journey in the mechanical keyboard world. Peace.